Thank you so much, Ara, for inviting me here, and thank you for coming tonight. Basically, I'm writing a new book, which should be ready by the end of next year. And the paper is really an attempt to summarize some ideas. So this is not a chapter, this is not or a section. It's really the combination of some ideas that's kind of spread out through different chapters. Okay. So I have a text, so I'll read it. It was someone told me that in America this is the kind of standard way to do it. Too late, I'm afraid. In my new book, I tend to explore how some artists, architects, and designers used ideas and struggles from operaismo and autonomia to produce visual works. So the book encompasses graphic design, architecture, urban planning, artwork in the most, let's say, traditional sense, some films, some documentary films. But it's very diverse, so it encompasses textile, the feminist component of autonomia produced textile. So I think this is one of the challenges for me and for the future reader. And today I think this is reflected in what I'm going to tell you. At first glance, if you think of my project, the project seems a bit strange because operaismo opposed the notion of cultural hegemony and refused to wage a cultural battle. This is a quite interesting and uncompromising sentence taken from Tronti's Workers and Capital in the early 60s. If culture, and I want to emphasize that if culture is the reconstruction of the totality of man, the search for his humanity in the world, a duty to keep united that which is divided, then it is something which is by nature reactionary and should be treated as such. The critique of ideology from the worker's point of view must consciously position itself as a critique of culture. Man, reason, history, these monstrous divinities should be fought and destroyed as if they were the power of the bosses. It is not true that capital has abandoned these ancient gods. It has simply turned them into the religion of the official workers' movement. The phrase the official workers' movement refers to the Communist Party and the trade unions, which operaismo saw as intrinsic to Italian capitalism. The phrase the workers' point of view summarizes well the matrix of the political and epistemological reversal championed by this trend of Marxism. But whose viewpoint is this? It was neither that of a putative working class culture, nor that of the unskilled workers in the free world and the Eastern Bloc. Operaismo advocated a class-based point of view, but again, what is class? In the tradition of operaismo, class describes neither a sociological constituency nor an intellectual adhesion to a set of values. The working class is not even defined by work because operaismo saw the refusal of work as a pivotal political strategy. The class of operaismo involved these aspects, but it is not limited to them. Operaismo tended to depict class as constantly being pulled out of shape, caught in an endless process of becoming, of class composition, a key notion of operaismo. Tronti captured this ontology of non-identity when he wrote that the working class is an enemy even of itself, qua capital, meaning as variable capital. So, the question is, how can you visualize workers or militants if you posit that the class is enemy even of itself? And I think that the need to visualize a political subjectivity is a crucial aesthetic and political question, even today, of course. Images represent ideas, but the opposite is also true. Images act and contribute to the materialization of a political subject. Be it the multitude, the 99%, the black lives, all the people of populists. So in my paper I will explore the visualization of workers, militants, workers and militants within the tradition of operaismo and autonomia. So although the heyday of factory workers seems to be over, at least in the West, I believe that operaismo's iconography of non-identity still offer insights into contemporary political iconography. Classe Operaia was the first fully operaista magazine. I will focus on some of the roughly 20 drawings that accompanied the articles. They were made by Mario Mariotti, an artist, designer and member of the Florentine group of Classe Operaia. In the tradition of the workers' movement, laborers are often muscular men along the lines of the iconography of Vulcan, the god of metal workers. Mariotti's workers departed from this genealogy. His laborers are small, joyful and sly. Rather than being bathed in sunshine, they often emerge from the night. A drawing published in the second issue of Classe Operaia is illuminating in this regard. This is the drawing. It presents a boss sleeping in his bed, and the caption reads, as you know, or some of you know, "Good night, Mr. Boss." The man's hands are redolent of the expressionist anatomy developed by Gros during his Spartacist years. Gros' repulsive bourgeois personified 1910s and 1920s gauchism, from Rosa Luxemburg to the Kronstadt sailors and the occupations, of course, of factories in Turin. I went to the archives of Mariotti. Mariotti died in the mid-90s, but his archive is in Prato, the Pecci Museum, and I went there. It was very useful because I found the preparatory sketches. And they really show you the complexity of the work, how subtle Mariotti was. Although, of course, the drawing is very small. So the preparatory sketches for his work are entitled L'Incubo, the Nightmare. This provides several clues. On one level, it refers to Henry Fuseli's painting, from which Mariotti borrows the conceit of depicting the nightmare on top of the sleeper, affording reality and imagination the same materiality. On another level, Mariotti references Goya's The Dream of Reason Produces Monsters, where winged monsters haunt a reclining man. Insofar as Mariotti's boss is sleeping, the room is in the dark, and the lamp should be understood as being part of the boss' nightmare. It is clearly an allusion to Guernica. But the other potential source of light, the brass flame that decorates the bed, betrays the boss' political allegiance. It reproduces the symbol of the neo-fascist party, MSI, as you can see. The other preparatory sketches reveal the spanner to be a metamorphosed wild cat. Classe Operaia saluted the wildcat strikes of Fiat factory workers, and Mariotti's cat connected these strikes with those of the industrial workers of the world, whose symbol was a cat with arched back and bare teeth and claws. Mariotti's rider is a worker, but he has none of a worker's usual features. The sketches hinted at his transformation. In his nightmare, the boss condensates, to use the Freudian terminology, the plumed helm of a knight with the welding helmet of a metal worker. The resulting crest, however, might induce the reader to detect an element of femininity, and rightly so, as the black cat, the long hair, and the nocturnal flight characterize the iconography of witches. One cannot but think of Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, which describes the witch hunt as a foundational moment in the formation of the working class. I think Mariotti's image reveals a gender bias. Sorry, you can go back here. In my view, it deliberately avoided emphasizing a link with women, despite the growing presence of women in Italian plans. It is possibly because of the ambiguity of the crest that Mariotti added the spurs to the rider, offsetting the female dimension with a virile connotation. In the boss Nightmare, the metal worker is as brave as a knight, as dreadful as a necromancer or a witch, and as free as a cowboy, and is enveloped in the anti-fascist light of Guernica. In Mariotti's drawings, the helm of the knight is generally associated with tycoons. As you know, prominent Italian business leaders can be awarded the Order of Merit for labor, thereby becoming knights, cavalieri, like Berlusconi. A comparative analysis of Mariotti's drawings enables a better understanding of the boss Nightmare. In Classe Operaia, Mariotti crafted a détournement of the cover of the weekly Epoca. Enthusiasm for the new Fiat car is debunked with levity. In light of this image, it is possible to say that the worker of the Nightmare has taken the plumed helm directly from a businessman's hat. In the night, he sports it as a battle trophy that evokes a scalp. The harrow lanes in his hands is itself the result of a transposition of another sharp object. In the first stages of the work, the flying metal worker held a pen. The shift from pen to harrow lanes illuminates the agency that Classe Operaia militants attributed to themselves. Operaisti never thought that they had to become or mimic factory workers. Quite the opposite, they echoed the contempt of the mass worker for his or her working conditions. The editorial team of Classe Operaia did include factory workers, but they represented a small minority. The pen, harrow, spear brandished by the metal work of Mariotti's sketches alludes to the activists' unapologetic reliance on complex theories which, they hoped, would become lethal weapons once in the right hands. Mariotti's work as a nightmare is attuned to the incipit of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which likens communism to a spectre that the ruling classes endeavor to exorcise. But Mariotti's revenants and creatures of the night, in the sketches, as you can see, a worker is a joyful skeleton, bottom right image, also stem from Tronti's portrayal of the class. Tronti argued that the class should embody an antisocial force acting as, quote, the irrational element within the specific rationality of capitalist production, unquote. But Tronti was no supporter of the mass's spontaneity. He darkened its depiction to make the remedy appear all the more urgent. Workers' revolt had to be organized, and this, he believed, could only be achieved by a new type of communist party, a class party, with its avant-gardes in the factories. Within Classe Operaia, Antonio Negri, represented the left wing, which argued, unlike Tronti, that the organization of the struggles would autonomously evolve from the class itself without the mediation of a party. Mariotti again depicted workers as monsters in a leaflet advertising the new series of Classe Operaia, 1966. Two workers drive a bulldozer in the night, chasing a terrified St. George. Mariotti entitled the work The Dragon and St. George, not St. George and the Dragon. The saint holds a crusader's shield, which was the Christian Democrat symbol. Yet, Mariotti's demonology articulates a deeper conflict than that opposing the class to the state. The workers and the bulldozer are a sole entity, a dragon. The grimaces of the workers echo the blade of the loader, which is another permutation of the bare claws of the wild cat. St. George is here the symbol of good against evil. So why did Mariotti identify the workers with a monster leaping out of the dark? 30 years after the end of classe operaia, Negri drew a comparison between a work by Picasso and Mariotti's Bulldozer. Negri wrote a negative review of a book about labor that reproduced Minotaur and his prey on its cover. You have the image on the left-hand side. The content of the book made the subtext of the cover eloquent enough. Workers' rights were being threatened by dark forces. It's a 2001 book by Marco Revelli. Commenting on the cover, Negri admitted that rather than feel empathy towards the victim, he still sided with the Minotaur, just as he had sided with Mariotti's dragon. This parallel, drawn by an insider, helps unravel the layers contained in Mariotti's humorous and yet epic fight. Picasso's woman can be associated with what the painter saw as the values jeopardized by fascism, so democracy, civilization, progress, and humanism. And these were the banners under which the Italian communist and socialist parties waged their electoral battles. In Mariotti's drawing, these values are encoded by St. George. The bulldozer typifies an onslaught to the Christian Democrats as much as to the pantheon of the institutional left. What is apparently missing is the princess that St. George liberates from the dragon. St. George did not slay the monster, but rather he tamed it. The princess is in the picture, but she has shared the trappings associated with her role. The worker's princess is technology. Mariotti's dragon drove away the night in order to tame and appropriate technology. For all of its insistence upon the politics embedded in technology, operaismo still had a technophile outlook. To update Lenin's definition of communism, Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country, classe operaia might have described it as worker power plus technology for the general intellect. After the end of classe operaia, Mariotti remained politically close to the operisti who broke with Tronti and launched Potere Operaio in 1969. Potere Operaio published a double full-page image of a Fiat worker made by Mariotti. The character's body language threatened to sodomize his opponents. Mariotti's cunning workers were now supplanted by a virile figure. His iconographic turn reflected a political shift. Mariotti's man suggested an unprecedented control over the shop floor. During the strikes of the hot autumn of 1969, the operista dream of workers' power seemed to almost come true. Having said this, Mariotti's smiley workers were not overtaken by the events. They metamorphosed into the most popular fictional character of the anti-parliamentary left, Gasparazzo, the protagonist of the comic strip published by Lotta Continua. Should one conclude that Mariotti had assimilated an iconography that aligned with the most Leninist tendencies of Potere Operaio? Yes, but only to a limited extent, because Mariotti's character did not resurrect the imagery of the Third International. His character was as much a muscular metal worker as a necromancer, attuned to the demonology of classe operaia. Potere Operaio readers immediately grasped the visual pan between Fiat and the Cachet Fiat, a pill for headaches that was unrelated to the automobile factory. Since the 30s, the drug had been advertised using the image of a sinister man. Mariotti emphasized the character's Mephistophelian connotations. The metal worker's flame-like eyebrows evoked Vulcan's furnace. But the visual source of the image also tied Mariotti's worker to a figure whose sardonic laughter and red skin recalled the devil. Mariotti's metal worker was cast, to borrow Goethe's description of Mephistopheles, as the spirit that always denies. Mariotti's workers conflate the pantheon of the mid-60s Italian far left, cancel communism, revolutionary trade unionism, militant anti-fascism, but also animals, specifically the cat, and figures not immediately associated with political iconography, including the cowboy, the American Indian, as portrayed in Western 1960s Westerns, the knight, the witch, and the dragon. Operaismo was an anti-dialectic form of Marxism. Mariotti reflected this attitude, but exacerbated it. His workers were not the PCR, the Communist Party workers, that part of humankind that would have saved the world. Mariotti's figures did not stand for an antithesis in a dialectic political process, but rather a total negation. His class refused the value of culture, peace, humanity, and did so with a smile on its face. Today, however, I think we can construe his workers as a prefiguration of the political iconography that we may need today, one that is aware of intersectionality and includes a plurality of figures. The syncretism inherent in this kind of imagery is at the core of the second part of my talk. So, in this part, I will concentrate on the figure of the militant, and in particular that of the political leader. For operaismo-minded artists, the figures of the militant and the leader were difficult to portray, because militants and leaders had to remain immanent to the class. So visualizing a leader as a guerrillero heroic or a hierarchic character would have proved contradictory. But even the insolent, if isolated laughter of Cohn-Bendit had obvious shortcomings. It is not surprising, after all, that one of the most accomplished representations of a leader that emerged from this tradition was that of a dead leader. I'm going to look at how Archizoom engaged with Malcolm X. So Archizoom was a Florence-based group of architects, designers active between 1966 and 1974, more or less. They were on friendly terms with Mariotti and met Tronti several times. This is the same picture as earlier Mariotti's at the table. Pier Vittorio Aureli's The Project of Autonomy was the first book to clarify the extent to which Archizoom was immersed in operaismo. His book focused mostly on a project called No Stop City, but I want to focus on an installation that the group made for the 1968 Triennale. In the late 60s, both Tronti and Negri began to study the history of the American working class. Tronti defined the American struggles of the 1933-1947 period as one of the highest peaks of class struggle in history. Archizoom too looked at the US, but not to the New Deal. The group was reading up on Black Power. The Black Panther Party and the role of Third Worldism and Islam played in the African American the role that Third Worldism and Islam played in the African American far left lacked Italian counterparts. In northern Italy, of course, discrimination against migrants from southern Italy was ubiquitous, but not comparable to the American history of slavery, forced conversions, and enforced segregation. Archizoom members did not problematize this gap or the fact that they were white. They simply appropriated what they recognized as affinities between the Black Panther Party's anti-integrationism and classe operaia's anti-progressivism, between the Panthers' irony about voting right and operaismo's dismissal of parliamentary democracy. But most importantly, the Black Panther Party had style. Retrospectively, the social policies of the Panthers, such as the health care program, are much more interesting than the trim afros. But in the late 60s, the self-fashioning of the Panthers was part and parcel of the politics. They shaped an aesthetic canon of black beauty that had virtually no precedence in Western culture. Its members' leather jackets, sunglasses, beret, badges, and afros demonstrated how a minority could combat its subordination and attract new members. Archizoom was fascinated with the Panthers' visual culture, as well as the British mod subculture, which they viewed as the expression of a new, clothing-conscious working class that rejected the bourgeois idea of decorum. Archizoom's exhibit at the 1968 Triennale was an environment entitled Center of Eclectic Conspiration. The center was in reality the first Archizoom cenotaphs, in this case the cenotaph for Malcolm X. The building responded to Etienne Boulez's cenotaph for Isaac Newton, which was rediscovered in the 60s. In the first part of my talk, I analyzed the traits of Mariotti's work. In the case of Archizoom, the leader is not visible. It's represented through the style of the cenotaph. The center was about 5 square meters large. A black fake silk curtain was hung from bars that delimited its perimeter. The group called the space a stand, a commercial architecture if ever there was one, but also a gazebo, an Orientalist pavilion structure that was the leitmotif of a series of environments made by the group. The black curtain referred to the Kashba, the most sacred site of Islam. Malcolm X went on a pilgrimage to Mecca a few months before his murder. Sheets of fake marble covered the floor, imitating the marble floor of the Kashba. Apart from Malcolm X, Islam was viewed by Archizoom positively because they associated it with the Arabs who had lost the Six-Day War the previous year. The space of the center was illuminated by 2 neon lights that cited Dan Flavin's work. Onlookers penetrated the space through an aperture in the curtain. The threshold was signaled by an embroidered oriental decoration and 2 bull's-eye windows, alluding to the doors typically found in industrial complexes. This aperture, proposed a political iconography for a new international class composition. The members of Archizoom hoped to see an alliance between factory workers and oppressed Muslims. Of course, these groups overlapped in many countries, but not in Italy at the time. After crossing through this aperture, viewers found themselves in a small vestibule with incongruously high bed tables. The upper part of these identical objects, you can see here on the left, the upper part of these objects was modeled on pie safes. Here, however, they were adorned with fake palm trees and acted as a reliquary. A huge condom dangled under them, as if to conjure an orgiastic funeral rite. A second cubicle, a sort of inner crypt, was separated from the vestibule by a transparent PVC curtain, which referred in a degraded form to a mosquito net canopy for Arabian Nights. The threshold consisted of a door frame covered in Glen plaid. Its color was redolent of the sandstone portals of the Florentine Renaissance, but the fabric referenced Malcolm X Glen plaid suits, which the group construed as a travesty of white middle-class poise. In his autobiography, Malcolm X tells that as a young man, he used to straighten his hair and dress in a manner that betrayed his psychological submission to white culture. How then was one meant to interpret his impeccable suits? For the members of Archizoom, Malcolm X's elegance aimed to reduce white middle-class respectability to a suit that can be purchased. The inner chamber preserved a Turkish bed featuring the Archizoom symbol, and the bed was bisected by a wooden panel. Undoing the modernist tenet of truth to the materials, a case of iridescent plastic gave the illusion that the panel was sheeted in mother of pearl. Fake candles were placed upon it, but the atmosphere for morning was sabotaged by the fluorescent neon light. Long ropes descended from the ceiling, poignantly evoking erotic games and Tarzan's lianas. A plywood tombstone faced the entrance. In the guise of an eagle, a stuffed common buzzard was perched on top of it to symbolize the role of the American establishment as an instigator of racism. On the tombstone, Archizoom places a photograph of Rap Brown, a leader of the Black Panthers Party. Malcolm X had been murdered, but he was not dead, the group seemed to say, for his struggles lived on in those of the Panthers. Archizoom was unable to test whether the public grasped the overwhelming symbolism of the stand. On the day of the inauguration, the Triennale was stormed and occupied by students and artists. The protesters debated but also destroyed, damaged and dismantled the exhibit. Archizoom did not participate in the occupation but supported the protest. In order to understand the iconography of this cenotaph gazebo stand, I need to clarify how the group understood kitsch. Archizoom saw as pop and kitsch those elements of the environment that we would call Orientalist today. But Archizoom developed a Marxist take on kitsch. For them, kitsch represented an operaista-minded response to the search for an authentic working-class culture, which was typical of the official workers' movement. Operaismo negated the existence of a pristine form of working-class culture. Its members took a cue from this principle and conceived of kitsch as the result of the appropriative impulse of the class. If modernist designers tended to decry kitsch as a petty bourgeois tendency of the proletariat, Archizoom viewed it as a weapon. The group denigrated those who idealized the working class as, quote, an immaculate lamb of God unsullied by the dirt of affluent society. Like Fanon says, revolutionary movements do not spontaneously find strength in an alternative role, but rather in an imitative one. The worker does not want a better world, but more money and less work. Trond, unquote. In their view, kitsch embodied a form of working-class wisdom that undermined the ability of bourgeois models to communicate social status. Quote, kitsch acknowledges neither an autonomous value, something that cannot be purchased with a product to consecrated culture, nor the existence of a cultural sphere with a non-negotiable price. Kitsch rejects the ideology of misery and identifies with affluent society, but without ascribing an extra economic value to it, unquote. For Archizoom, kitsch was neither a conscious subversion of bourgeois culture nor a frivolous attachment to it. It was both less and more. Kitsch unwillingly negated the idea that culture constituted an autonomous sphere where values were protected from commodification. The example of a souvenir can probably clarify the group's point. When a proletarian purchased a plastic reproduction of Michelangelo's David, this choice did not represent for Archizoom a homage to the ineffable harmony of a landmark of humanism. Rather, the shoddy token expressed the desire to travel, to possess beauty, power, and knowledge. Most importantly, the purchase revealed the conviction that everything can be objectified and obtained. It is only a matter of money. Kitsch concretized for them a form of subconscious iconoclasm, debasing high moral values from a materialistic perspective. So this explains the group's fascination with pop art. Its members understood pop as an articulation of kitsch. They used pop's visual world and stereotypes to anchor their work to the solid ground that Archizoom deemed meaningful, that of capitalist culture. The group observed that due to its enhanced global ambitions, neo-capitalism, a very operaist way to describe the form that capitalism took in the early 60s. So neo-capitalism tended to domesticate and co-opt the lifestyles that contradicted its ethos. So as a result, Archizoom noted the visual world of the late 60s capitalism was pronouncedly syncretic. Archizoom tended to make a distinction between eclecticism and kitsch. Eclecticism and kitsch were the obverse and reverse of the same coin, but eclecticism described the main cultural strategy of neo-capitalism. Kitsch defined the same phenomenon but apprehended from the inverted perspective, from the worker's point of view. So the visual grammar of Center of Eclectic Conspiration employed the paratactic syntax and creative chaos that the group saw as immanent to both eclecticism and kitsch. So to sum up, Archizoom was not interested in celebrating Malcolm X as a historical figure. The group used the leader to make a point about a new international class composition that had to include black Muslims, oppressed Arabs in the Middle East, the Black Panther Party, as well as Italian factory workers. The group did not search for an alternative working class culture, for a utopia outside the system, but rather the cenotaph coded kitsch as a political and aesthetic response immanent to capitalist syncretism. Okay, this is come to the third and last part of the talk, where I will discuss the monsters made by Pablo Echaurren. Mariotti's monsters return, as you can see, but here monstrosity is no longer a subtext. It is the main feature. Pablo Echaurren is one of Roberto Matta's sons. However, Echaurren claims that his putative father is Gianfranco Baruchello, a prominent artist with whom you may be familiar. Baruchello, this is not as well known. Baruchello was an very active member of Potere Operaio in Rome. When Echaurren was only 20, he began to exhibit at Arturo Schwarz's gallery. Schwarz was the gallery owner who had replicated a few of Duchamp's ready-mades in a limited edition series in 1964. In the early 70s, Echaurren was a Marxist and invented a style that was at once militant and very accessible to the lay public. This is what you can see here as well. He did not join the political groups that were formed around 1969. It was part of what came to be called the autonomia movement in the mid-70s. In February 1977, Echaurren began working almost full-time for Lotta Continua. The group Lotta Continua had been dissolved, but the newspaper of the same name was still being published and sold about 100,000 copies. In 1977, Lotta Continua became the main outlet of the 1977 movement, and in particular the section devoted to the readers' letters best embodied the spirit of that year. So what was the 1977 movement? Okay, let me be a bit provocative. 1977 has little to do with 1968. 1977 was the first political movement of precarious workers. In that year, the autonomia movement reached its apex, but its origins date back to 1973 and 1974. The oil crisis generated unprecedented rates of unemployment and a definitive break with the political hegemony of the male factory worker. At the same time, the Italian Marxist groups that emerged in the post-68 years entered a period of crisis and had all dissolved by 1977. After the coup in Chile, the Italian Communist Party pushed for an alliance with the Christian Democrats. For the PCI, the death of Allende demonstrated that an electoral victory of the leftist front would have led to a neo-fascist coup, possibly backed by the CIA. This impasse proved that the Italian democracy was not really a democracy. So bear in mind that the Communist Party obtained 34% of the vote in 1976. In the far left camp, new references began complementing Marxism, such as Deleuze, Guattari and Foucault. New political frameworks emerged, including feminism, environmentalism, and the LGBT movement. And new groupings came to the fore, such as the circles of proletarian youth and the metropolitan Indians. Echaurren was a metropolitan Indian, one of the creative components of the 1977 movement. These wings, these creative components, cohabited not without tensions with more militaristic groupings. So automation, outsourcing, unemployment, demonstrations ending in gunfire. So who is the worker in 1977 and what is communism? Rousseau defined communism as young and new, as the totality of liberation. Some autonomy worked in the plants a few months a year, but they could not be more different from the skilled workers whose social identity was anchored in their job. In 1977, Negri argued that while operaismo had recognized the emergence of the mass worker in the early 60s, it was now time to understand a new class composition, one that included workers who smoked weed on the assembly line. One of the most important zines of the 1977 movement was Attraverso. Echaurren agreed with its notion of transversalità, derived from Guattari's notion of transversalité. His admiration was so strong that he used the proto-punk lettering of Attraverso to create an ithyphallic figure. Echaurren defined his character as the uomo trasversale, the transversal man. So the 1977 version of the uomo universale, the polymath. In Lotta Continua, Echaurren tapped into vanguard strategies to challenge the doctrinarism of the revolutionary left. He used limericks, collage, games, surrealist black humor, and data-minded pranks. He also organized actions that were reminiscent of conceptual art. At a demonstration, he handed out leaflets that read, "Freedom for the jailed comrades. The militants that hand out this leaflet have been arrested." People took them and declared their solidarity without grasping the paradox. In parallel with this work for Lotta Continua, he and other metropolitan Indians produced fanzines such as Il Complotto di Zurigo. This fanzine pretended that a group of political activists had been arrested and their headquarters, the Café Voltaire, had been shut down by the Swiss police. The fanzine was presented at the occupied University of Rome in a bid to satirize the lack of humor and the militaristic components of autonomia. So needless to say that in both cases, Echaurren's actions were daring. Baiting armed autonomy was a risky business. So in any case, his parodies should not be misread as the beginning of the process that would result in the jadedness of the 80s. The creative wing of the 1977 movement did not wish to replace Karl with Groucho Marx. Rather, it strove to let Groucho Marx died in 1977, this is why the joke was made at the time. Rather, the creative wing strove to let Marx cohabit with Groucho, claiming the political legitimacy of hedonism. Both Maurizio Calvesi and Umberto Eco were quick to seize the novelty of this widespread use of avant-garde communicative strategies. I don't want to focus on this broad phenomenon, however. I am going to discuss the monsters or very unusual animals of Echaurren. Let me show you some of them. Okay, this is the section called letters from the readers. As you can see, the format is very similar, and the monsters are a comment on. The image is not great, actually. They're very blurred. So there are at least, I guess, 3 ways to read these monsters. Right? Some others. Some of them are actually at the Beinecke Library in Yale. Echaurren sold some of his materials to the Beinecke Library. So the first way is to place them within the long temporality of political iconography. The monster is a recurring element of heraldry and political iconography, from Leviathan to Hydra and the Centaur. Teratology long defined the study of monsters, prodigies, marvels, and abnormalities. Before the 18th century, these categories often overlapped. Consider the tradition of the cabinets of curiosity. Echaurren's monsters can be seen as a form of political teratology. In this case, for example, this one, in this case we have a sort of Leviathan pierced by Cupid's arrow. On the feet of the robot you can read Urstaat, Urstate. The rat brigades wanted to hit at the heart of the state. Echaurren's robot pokes fun at the paranoiac idea that power lies at the heart of the state. On the other hand, the figure could also be construed as a Marxist Frankenstein, a militant robotized by a 10-year immersion in Marxist-Leninism. In the reader's letters, one can often sense their unease, the unease of militants. Many confess their inability to make sense of their needs and desires in Marxist terms. So the obscure symbol, I'm afraid the image is not very good, but it's above, so the obscure symbols on the right-hand side allude to this kind of state of chaos that was conveyed by the letters of the readers. So the second interpretation consists of reading these monsters as an indirect response to what Foucault called les anormaux, the abnormal ones, in his Collège de France lectures of 1974-1975. Foucault focused on the 18th century and explored the human monster, the individual to be corrected, and the child masturbator. The monsters of Echaurren's cabinet of curiosities stand for a politicized, if libertarian, youth that was proud of its quirkiness and queerness. Some militants called themselves communist freaks in English. From an iconographic perspective, the figure of the monster has the advantage of positing a radical otherness. Monsters are not clearly gendered. They're often unique and cannot be classified in any species. Unlike demons, which are supposedly created by God, monsters long posed problems to Christian scholars because they did not fit into the chain of beings, the hierarchical structure of all matter and forms of life. The monster as... Oh, sorry, I had a better image actually. The monster as the communist freak was the most accepted interpretation of Echaurren's characters. So take the example of Echaurren's fanzine Osk with its monsters, or a book of poems written by another metropolitan Indian, and the title is a pun. Diversi means different ones, deviant, but diversi means made of verses. In Lotta Continua, Charon reviewed the Italian translation of the Liber Monstrorum, an early 8th century catalogue of marvelous creatures. His review, partly humorous, delineated an analogy, a quite clear analogy between ancient monsters and the marvelous freaks of the 1977 movement. The third and last reading I propose places again these monsters within the framework of a long temporality, but this time it is no longer the temporality of political teratology, but that of biology. Echaurren's monsters can be seen as hopeful monsters. In the 40s, a German-born American geneticist called Richard Goldschmidt challenged the gradualism of Darwinism. He argued that while Darwinism works within species, sometimes new species do appear suddenly and can swiftly develop as a result of a large genetic mutation. So these animals are called hopeful monsters. In 1981, one of the last magazines to be born of the autonomia movement, Metropoli, published a series of articles written by Virno and Franco Berardi, also known as Bifo. The images that accompanied the articles depicted monsters as tongue-in-cheek symbols of a social mutation. One article was entitled Hopeful Monster, as you can see, and compared the subjectivities that appeared in the latter part of the 70s to Hopeful Monsters. So while it was clear that no revolution was forthcoming, the author suggested that a genetic mutation had begun. Okay, so I have come to the conclusion of my talk. I've tried to show how artists linked to operaismo and autonomia engage with the figure of the worker, the leader, and the new politicized youth that emerged in the mid-60s. On the one hand, the iconographies aligned with the ideas of theorists. On the other, the works of Mariotti, Archizoom, and Echaurren resisted a merely illustrative function. These artists delved into epistemes, narratives, and imaginaries that did not belong to the mainstream current of operaismo and autonomia. Not only do they tell us a different story about operaismo and autonomia, but some of these images, I believe, still offer insights for the present. And today we have an advantage. The immense availability of images allows us a more sophisticated political iconography. So how do we picture precarious laborers, the new working class, the multitude, the 99%, and the alliances between different political subjectivities all around the world? How do we imagine and portray the enemies? Thank you. This is a very interesting topic, and actually I would like to explore it maybe in the future. I think, okay, so as I said, the Arabs that lost the Six-Day War were definitely a reference point. Black Panthers, but also Gaddafi. In fact, Archizoom, just as other designers, made, I think, what is called the national costume. In 1972, Gaddafi had this kind of, I don't know, wanted to, I suspect, negotiate the political identity of Libya, and asked in a group of international designers to submit proposal for a Libyan national costume, and Archizoom actually made a booklet with some projects and also very interesting comment on these costumes. And I actually asked some of them, so why Gaddafi? And they said to me, you know, at the time, Gaddafi was interesting, was an interesting political figure for us. I think Islam, left-wing political Islam or third worldist Islam was very interesting because it kind of complicated the dichotomic framework of the time, but also the kind of strictures of Marxist-Leninism, which does not quite consider religion as something that can be, you know, useful for political consciousness. So I think, in a way, they knew little, but I mean, in a kind of, you know, I don't think they were interested in the religion, but in the kind of combination of leftist politics and Islam. And I think this is a very interesting topic today. You know, if you think of, for example, well, anyways, it's a different story. No, I don't think I want to reconcile kitsch and monster. I think there are two different ways to engage with political iconography. But in the case of kitsch, Archizoom used it as a way to produce meaning, as a semantic process, to oppose to eclecticism, which was the same thing, but on the other hand, it was the logic of capitalism. Monsters are, I mean, obviously are related, but I guess they're not strictly related to kitsch as I discussed it here today. the two different and yeah, you know, compatible semantic strategies. Mm. So I wouldn't reconcile them, if it makes sense.
Just following on Daniel's question, thinking about, I'm interested in this notion of operaismo being an anti-dialectical, at least culturally speaking,
Yeah.
strategy, and then this notion of akin to something imminent, that you call it imminent to the syncretism of capitalism. Um, it's interesting because Pasolini was also profoundly anti-dialectical, um, and yet obviously came up with completely different conclusions about how politics and aesthetics should relate to each other. Do you think that this notion of operaismo, the kind of intrinsic appropriation of kitsch, grew out of that sort of early 60s moment of pop and the Gruppo 63, which thought that, okay, if there is no longer any outside to capitalist culture, particularly under neo-capitalism, then we have to use the mechanisms and aphorias of capitalist culture itself against it, right? That there was that using a kind of Trojan horse of capitalism's own mechanisms from within its own mechanism. Do you think that can we trace a trajectory with
I think so. I think it's ultimately is or retrospectively quite similar, but I think there are, you know, significant differences. Um, well, of course, I mean the 90s, you know, 63 group, it was very heterogeneous, so it's very difficult to say something general. But okay, I can probably tell you something that um, is interesting. Asa Rosa, who was an operaist at the time, was one of the most active members of Classe Operaia, uh, reviewed the book that was edited after the Gruppo 63 meeting in Palermo, I think. And you know, it was quite curious. His review is in a kind of difficult to find journal of the time, and it was quite curious. And I thought it would, you know, it would really bash them. In fact, he said, "No, no, no, I actually like this. I like this 96, this 63 Gruppo 63, because we like negation. We like a kind of, yeah." He said something like, "You have a soft spot for avant-garde movements that try to negate reality too." But then, of course, he said, "You know, this is all well and good, but you have to be very careful because it quickly turns into just another form of culture. So negation is fine as long as it is associated with some sort of form of political organization. Otherwise, it it turns out to be just a game." Um, so I think there was a kind of at least initially there was a kind of mutual interest. Um, and some operisti like Baruchello were also part of the Gruppo 63. Uh, but they quite early on the situation changed, particularly when the Gruppo 63 became a sort of new establishment. So it was less interest. But then again, after 68, they kind of meet again for Quindici. It's very interesting what you said about Pasolini because it's precisely a different way of being anti-dialectical. But I think the kind of shared enemy was the Communist Party and the dialectic, not
well,
so.
and yet, although Pasolini, strangely enough, for all of his persecution by the Communist Party, remained a staunch communist.
Yeah,
Like he had no interest in the anti-parliamentary movement.
yeah.
He collaborated briefly with Vivo on a film, but other than that, he really had, Vifo's writings about Pasolini is that Pasolini was basically reactionary,
Mm,
which is in many ways true.
yeah.
But this notion of imminence, I think, is critical because coming out of the Gruppo 63, Eco calls
Well, yes and no, because if you think of Tafuri's articles in Contropiano, I mean, there are no illustrations, but they're extremely important for the history of architecture even today. But it's true. I mean, they look at architecture and urban planning, but they tend to be focused on literature like Thomas Mann and yeah. Um, I think Cacciari is another interesting person at the time because he also wrote about laws, the architecture of laws. But it's true. I mean, I guess the more philosophical and literary, whereas autonomia remained a a mass movement with its own popular culture. So these zines are, of course, you have Totò sometimes associated with Marx and or D'Annunzio so high and low are just put together in a very ironic way. Hmm. Well, I guess, well, first of all, Mariotti was a member, so it was not someone coming from outside. But yeah, I think some aspect, but I mean, this is one of the most kind of conceptually layered image. Some images are less complicated and more straightforward, like this one, for example. But the others are very direct. In this case, I guess Guernica was probably something people recognize more than today, maybe. Grows, I don't know, but um, I think this is not a sort of agitprop material, so that the first goal of which should be, you know, legibility. Uh, it's a commentary on the text, but it's also an artist trying to engage with what is listening at the meetings, and this is precisely what happened. Mariotti was there at the meeting, spoke very little, and drew, and this is something many people confirmed. Um, and I think, yeah, it's sometimes a very interesting translation of the ideas. Sometimes it's more than that. It's a kind of more artistic uh, take on 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 the ideas. Um, but I think the very interesting aspect of it is that 30 years, 40 years later, nobody remembers the article, but some people still remember the images. In fact, some of these images were reproduced in the magazines of Autonomia, so 10 years later, and they were basically symbols of a kind of shared identity, images. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. you're absolutely right. I mean, there are two key connections to Arte Povera. Celand was friends with Archizoom in 1970. Write a few letters, very interesting ones actually, and he was supposed to write about Archizoom very early on. In fact, he didn't do it. He did it later when the group was already disbanded. In terms of the Piper Club and the kind of pop culture, you're absolutely right. I mean, Deganello, one of the group members, was teaching as a I guess sort of in Italy it's called assistente. So it's not a kind of the assistant of a professor, but in fact sometimes professors are absolutely completely absent, and the students are 25 are in charge of teaching. And he designed a course about clubs and bars in 1963, 4, or even earlier. And absolutely, the culture of discotheques, and clubs were a key reference. When they go to London in 1964, they're fascinated with this kind of, we're swinging in London. They go dancing. It's absolutely central. But it's very true. I need to think about this kind of connection to the theme of the Triennale, because this is something I haven't done it really. Thank you. Thank you.